Hello, I am Rose Solari, poet, fiction writer, reviewer, and co-founder with James J. Patterson of Allen Squire Publishing, a small press with big ideas. As you know, I'm usually here every Wednesday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, but for the last 4 weeks, I've been taking a break. And I had some wonderful folks stand in for me who I'd like to thank right now. All the writers from ASP are incredible team players, and four of them jumped in and took my slot in the last 4 weeks and did an amazing job. So if you haven't seen them yet, they're still up here on Facebook. They're also at allensquirepublishing.com. And I'd like to thank Elizabeth Hazen, Joanna Bigger, Linda Watanabe McFerrin, and Mark Pritchard, who all did an amazing job and put their own stamp on this little show I've got going on Wednesdays. So much love and thanks to all of them. I encourage you to check those videos out. They also get uploaded the following day to allensquirepublishing.com, so you can always check out our backlog of videos there. James and I started doing this in April. He's on every Monday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time in the States. So I really hope that you will take a look at some of those videos and get a little inspiration for your own creative endeavors, whatever they may be. Before I get started on today's theme, which is about the books and writers that made me want to become a writer, I'm going to share some great news from Allen Squire Publishing. We had planned initially to publish a book by a wonderful poet, Catherine Young. She's a poet and a translator, and her first collection of poems, Day of the Border Guards, is something I'd highly recommend. We are very excited that we have acquired Catherine's second collection, Woman Drinking Absinthe. It's a wonderful book, very powerful, very strong. And we had originally hoped to publish it this fall to coincide with our 10th anniversary of being in the world and running a small press. But when the virus stuff kicked in, we thought, let's serve the book well. Let's not rush. It's a book that we think deserves live readings and the kind of support that only a live reading can give. So Catherine and I discussed it and agreed to move the publication of the book to March 2021. So we're getting it together now. It's going to be going to press soon, and we are so thrilled about this book. Catherine is an amazing writer, and I highly recommend that you check out her work and her Russian translations. So I want to share one poem from that book today. And this is called Today I'm Writing Love Songs, and it's for the great Russian poet Marina Tsvetaeva. I'm not a Russian speaker. Anyway, here's a terrific poem by Catherine Young. Today I'm writing love songs, Marina, as if you yourself had written none, as if no other woman ever felt or smelled or tasted love's ripe flesh, never stripped love's husk to find succor within, until I, arriving with my hand outstretched, plucked at it from idle curiosity. I promise, Marina, I'll savor this love whole, run my lips along its rim, swallow juices, rind, pips, drink in each drop as if it's the last. Passion slips from its skin, dissolves sweet, hot, sour, bitter, salty on my tongue. Recalling foods fashioned by the ancients who stirred seeds of love in their cooking pots. They say I look young again, Marina, my skin's furrows softened by gentle rain. But you and I, we descend from monsoon. Our sword of love engorges the river, corduroys the fields, drowns the seedlings asleep in cradling earth. Heat, water, ooze, fruit rotting in mud. No havens safe from us. So that's Catherine Young from her forthcoming collection of poems, Woman Drinking Absinthe. All right, so today I'm going to talk about the writing that made me want to become a writer myself. Much of that had to do with my amazing father, Joseph Solari, who knew the poetry he loved from memory and would recite it and toss it into conversations. And it just wove through his everyday life. Poetry was just part of the language that he spoke. And so, as a kid, I was exposed to this great volume of wisdom and beautiful language and terrific poetry. And before I could read myself, was familiar with lines from Shakespeare and Keats, things that would just pepper his conversation. Um, and as an example of that, oh, hello, Jim Luke. Hello, Lorena Rivas. All right, I got some friends back. Isn't that lovely? I was afraid people wouldn't show up after my absence, so it's really nice to see you. Um, this is one of the poems my dad used to quote from. This is Shakespeare's Sonnet 109. I love this poem. And I was a willful kid, I would say, and a bit temperamental. Um, and if my father disappointed me in some way, if he perhaps didn't take me out for the ice cream I wanted or something, I could get quite indignant and say, Daddy, you lied, or Daddy, you promised. Or I didn't take disappointment well then. I still actually don't take disappointment well. But in any event, his response would often be, oh, never say that I was false of heart. And as with many of his quotations for years, I thought that this was something he'd made up himself. Imagine my surprise when I discovered that Sonnet 109 is not about a missed trip to Highs for an ice cream cone, but about something a bit bigger. I had the honor of reading this poem at the Folger Shakespeare Library a few years ago, in an event that the wonderful Terry Cross Davis, who runs the poetry programming there, holds every year on Shakespeare's birthday. People come and read sonnets, and I got to do that there, which was an immense honor. And I think Dad, if he were still alive, would have been absolutely thrilled. Anyway, also my name appears in the last line, though it's not as a woman's name, it's as a rose, the flower, which you may or may not know to the Elizabethans was a symbol of extraordinary spiritual power, and wholeness, completeness, which I think is wonderful as well. So this is Sonnet 109. Oh, never say that I was false of heart, though absence seemed my flame to qualify. As easy might I from myself depart, as from my soul, which in thy breast doth lie. That is my home of love. If I have ranged like him that travels, I return again, just to the time, not with the time exchanged, so that myself bring water for my stain. Never believe, though in my nature reigned all frailties that besiege all kinds of blood, that it could so preposterously be stained, to leave for nothing all thy sum of good. For nothing this wide universe I call, save thou, my rose, in it thou art my all. Sonnets permeated my young life, and in my books I have several unrhymed sonnets. They run throughout the books. That 14-line form with the couplet that turns it around, the Elizabethan sonnet form, much more than the Petrarchan form, actually, even though my family is Italian, was the one that really influenced me as a young poet. And here's another example of that from another of my dad's favorite writers, John Keats. I picked this one because it's also about fame and wanting to become a famous writer. And I think as a young romantic girl, love and fame were my goals. Not too grandiose, right? And we're going to return to this theme later in Louisa May Alcott. But in any event, so it was interesting to me to read a poem where those values are questioned. And Again, Keats was one of my dad's favorites, and I heard him recite this many, many times. When I have fears that I may cease to be, before my pen has gleaned my teeming brain, before high-piled books and charactery hold like rich garners the full ripened grain, when I behold upon the night's starred face huge cloudy symbols of a high romance, and think that I may never live to trace their shadows with the magic hand of chance, and when I feel, fair creature of an hour, that I shall never look upon thee more, never have relish in the fairy power of unreflecting love, then on the shore of the wide world I stand alone and think, till love and fame to nothingness do sink. So a little Keats, a little Shakespeare to get started, and then as I got a little older and began to read bigger books, not picture books, real books, two of my favorites early on were Louisa May Alcott's Little Women and Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. And I think, looking back on it now, that one of the reasons I love those books so much is that they portray characters who are of an artistic and an intellectual inclination. If you know Little Women, you know that Jo is a writer. You know that that Amy is a painter. Laurie, the one who courts Jo and eventually marries Amy, wants to be a musician. They all have these big ambitions that I think I really related to when I was that age, and probably still relate to. It's funny, my husband and I went to see the new movie of Little Women. I think it was one of the last movies we saw before the shutdown happened. And I said to him when we were going into the movie theater, everybody thinks that I should identify with Jo because she's the writer. I identify with a different character. Let's see if you can figure out who it is. And the minute Frances Pugh, the wonderful actor Frances Pugh, spun around in her chair and said, "I'm Amy," he said, "That's her." Amy's the youngest. She has ambitions to be a great artist. Like me as a kid, at one point in the book, they say she never had time for fairy stories and she wasn't interested in dolls. This too was very true of me as a young person. I was the youngest in my family by a long way, and I dismissed a lot of things as childish. I wanted to be an adult. I wanted to be recognized as an adult. It's a dilemma that Amy too suffers from in this book. But she ends up in a pretty good place. And so I thought I'd read a couple of sections from Little Women that meant and mean a great deal to me. This is a beautiful passage early on in the book. They're all young, the four daughters and Laurie, the boy, literally the boy next door, the wealthy boy next door. Because remember, these girls were really poor. So if you think their fantasies of wealth are in some way shallow, keep in mind they have nothing, okay? And they're dependent on the kindness of relatives and others to help them survive. They often don't have enough to eat. It's really straitened circumstances for these girls. So one afternoon, they're all out on a picnic together, the four of them and Laurie, and the chapter's even called Castles in the Air. And they talk about their fantasies. And I think this passage is just lovely. It's so full of youthful ambition and youthful enthusiasm and maybe a little naivete, but what the hell? The only other thing I think you need to know about this passage is that Meg is already beginning to be courted. She's the eldest, and she's very beautiful, and she's a good person too. And she's already beginning to be courted, and this annoys Jo, who still would like to keep the family together forever, the four girls forever, which, as we know, doesn't happen in life. But anyway, it'll help you understand some of the undercurrents to this section to hear that. Okay, here we go. They decide to share their castles in the air, and Laurie starts. After I'd seen as much of the world as I want to, I'd like to settle in Germany and have just as much music as I choose. I'm to be a famous musician myself, and all creation is to rush to hear me. And I'm never to be bothered about money or business, but just enjoy myself and live for what I like. That's my favorite castle. What's yours, Meg? Margaret seemed to find it a little hard to tell hers, and moved a little break before her face, as if to disperse imaginary gnats, while she said, slowly, I should like a lovely house, full of all sorts of luxurious things. Nice food, pretty clothes, handsome furniture, pleasant people, and heaps of money. I am to be mistress of it and manage it as I like, with plenty of servants, so I never need to work a bit. How I should enjoy it, for I wouldn't be idle, but do good and make everyone love me dearly. Wouldn't you have a master for your castle in the air? Asked Laurie slyly. I said pleasant people, you know, said Meg, and carefully tied up her shoe as she spoke so that no one saw her face. Why don't you say that you have a splendid, wise, good husband and some angelic little children? You know your castle wouldn't be perfect without, said blunt Joe, who had no tender fancies yet and rather scorned romance, except in books. You'd have nothing but horses, inkstands, and novels in yours, answered Meg petulantly. Wouldn't I, though? I'd have a stable full of Arabian steeds, rooms piled with books, and I'd write out of a magic inkstand so that my work should be as famous as Laurie's music. I want to do something splendid before I go into my castle, something heroic or wonderful that won't be forgotten when I'm dead. I don't know what, but I'm on the watch for it and mean to astonish you all some day. I think I shall write books and get rich and famous. That would suit me. So that is my favorite dream. Mine is to stay at home with father and mother and help take care of the family, said Beth. Don't you wish for anything else? Asked Laurie. Since I had my little piano, I am perfectly satisfied. I only wish we may all keep well and be together, nothing else. I have lots of wishes, but the pet one is to be an artist and to go to Rome and to paint fine pictures and be the best artist in the whole world, was Amy's modest desire. They make a pact that they'll meet up in 10 years and see how close they are to their dreams. I love that scene. I think it's so delightful. So later in the book, much later, Beth dies, as many of you know. In fact, when my father read me Little Women, I just thought of this. When my dad read me Little Women as a kid, he left Beth's death scene out. He thought it was too sad. This was before I could read myself, so I must have been, I don't know, 4, something like that, maybe 5. Um, he he left Beth's death scene out. He didn't think that it was appropriate for me, that it was too sad. And so when I read the book myself and discovered Beth had died, that was another moment of, hey, Daddy, what were you doing? It was it was interesting, and he just said, I didn't think you should have to go through that, honey. So it was interesting to discover that we lost Beth. And he would even kind of weave her back into the story. He'd mention her here and there. He had a great imagination. I don't know how he pulled it off. Anyway, Amy does end up going to Rome and then to France with her Aunt March, who is wealthy, and decides that Amy would make a good companion. And in Rome, Amy decides to give up her artistic ambition. It's a sad scene for me. It kind of broke my heart. I wanted to see Amy go on and be a great painter, but she says to Laurie at one point, talent isn't genius, and no amount of energy can make it so. Which is heartbreaking to me, given that we've just seen her talk about her artistic aspirations in this last scene. Anyway, Now she's a few years older. Laurie has proposed to Joe and been rejected. As a young person, I thought Joe was an idiot, but I'm glad he ended up with Amy because Amy's my girl. Um, anyway, at this point in the book, Amy, there, this is the point in the book when she and Laurie realize that they're in love, and there's a subtlety and a simplicity and an elegance to the way Alcott describes it. She also uses a technique that I often find fascinating in novels of that era, where she breaks the wall and talks to the reader directly, as Charlotte Bronte does in Jane Eyre. So at this point, Amy is in France. She's gotten word that Beth has died. Um, and Laurie is on his way to come and comfort her because they've been friends, since childhood. So Alcott sets the scene. A pleasant old garden on the borders of the lovely lake, with chestnuts rustling overhead, ivy climbing everywhere, and the black shadow of the tower falling far across the sunny water. At one corner of the wide, low wall was a seat, and here Amy often came to read or work or console herself with the beauty all about her. She was sitting there that day, leaning her head on her hand, with a homesick heart and heavy eyes, thinking of Beth and wondering why Laurie did not come. She did not hear him cross the courtyard beyond, nor see him pause in the archway that led from the subterranean path into the garden. He stood a minute, looking at her with new eyes, seeing what no one had ever seen before, the tender side of Amy's character. Everything about her mutely suggested love and sorrow. The blotted letters in her lap, the black ribbon that tied up her hair, the womanly pain and patience in her face, even the little ebony cross at her throat seemed pathetic to Laurie, for he had given it to her, and she wore it as her only ornament. If he had any doubts about the reception she would give him, they were set at rest the minute she looked up and saw him, for, dropping everything, she ran to him, exclaiming in a tone of unmistakable love and longing, "Oh, Laurie, Laurie, I knew you'd come to me." I think everything was said and settled there, for as they stood together, quite silent for a moment, with the dark head bent down protectingly over the light one, Amy felt that no one could comfort and sustain her so well as Laurie. And Laurie decided that Amy was the only woman in the world who could take Joe's place and make him happy. He did not tell her so, but she was not disappointed, for both felt the truth, were satisfied, and gladly left the rest to silence. I just think that's a beautiful scene. I love that scene. So, one more. Another book that I dearly loved as a kid is Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. And I know people make jokes about Mr. Rochester and the gothic nature of the romance, but the fact is that Jane is a tremendously impressive and powerful character. Um, like the March Girls, she survives great deprivation, though in Jane's case it's even greater because she has no family to love her. She's an orphan. Her aunt, who takes her in, is very abusive to her. Finally, sends her to an absolutely horrible orphanage where the kids are abused and starved, and many of them die. And this is taken directly from Bronte's own life. Her father sent his daughters to such a place. Horrible. Anyway, one of the things I love about Jane is that she's committed to the life of her mind and to her intelligence. And I think Jane Eyre is in many ways a book about the importance of education for women and education as liberation. And Jane relies on her intelligence a great deal of the time. She's also an artist. She paints and draws very well, and that is commented on throughout the book. And it's one of the first things that Mr. Rochester is impressed by with her when he asks her to show him her portfolio. Um, Jane also does not believe the notion that money implies virtue, um, or that wealth is somehow deserved by those who have it, which seems to be a notion abroad at the land these days in those of us in charge of our country. But let's leave that aside for the moment and stick with Jane Eyre. Um, and one of the most powerful scenes in the book to me is when she informs Mr. Rochester that they are equals. He's been playing with her. He's tried to make her jealous by paying a lot of attention to another woman, a wealthy woman, Blanche Ingram, who many people think he will marry. And at this point in the book, this is just before they admit their love to each other. I know love's a theme today. What can I tell you? And I think it's one of Jane's most powerful scenes. You have to keep in mind that we are told in the book many times that she's not pretty, that she's very plain. And for me, as a young reader, for whom adolescence was not kind, okay, um, let me put it to you this way. I had glasses in the second grade. They didn't make compressed lenses back then, so I had the big, thick ones with the black frames. Puberty came early, so I developed early, which is not a blessing, trust me, um, especially if you're a little self conscious already. I had several years of acne, no fun for anyone. And I was in ballet school for much of those years, so I kind of walked like a duck. Also, I spent a lot of time in my books. So I was a bit nerdy and identified with Jane, being plain and not having advantages and not having wealth or power. But I also identified with her being smart and with her knowing how to stand up for herself at the right time. And this scene has, I've always found this scene tremendously moving. And as with the other scenes from Louisa May Alcott's book, it really made me want to write myself, like the sonnets I read earlier. I I didn't just love them, but I thought, oh, what if I could do that? Um, and this is one of the scenes that made me feel, what if I could do that? All right, Rochester and Jane are going for a walk on the grounds of Thornfield Hall, where they live, where Jane's been for the past few years, the tutor, the governess for Rochester's ward, Adele, a little French girl who was the daughter of one of his lovers. Um, he has told her, he's really pushing this jealousy thing with her. He's told her he's going to marry. He hasn't told her who, but she assumes it's Blanche Ingram, the wealthy, rather shallow woman he's been courting, and that she'll have to go away, that he's going to send Adele away to school, and Jane will have to go find another position. And he asks her um, if she'll be sorry to leave Thornfield. Jane is usually very placid, but she's got violent inner life, violent emotions, and this is a scene I think that describes that beautifully. The vehemence of emotion, stirred by grief and love within me, were claiming mastery and struggling for full sway and asserting a right to predominate, to overcome, to live, rise, and reign at last, and yes, to speak. And here's what she says to him: I grieve to leave Thornfield. I love Thornfield. I love it because I have lived in it a full and delightful life. Momentarily, at least, I have not been trampled on. I have not been petrified. I have not been buried with inferior minds and excluded from every glimpse of communion with what is bright and energetic and high. I have talked face to face with what I reverence, with what I delight in, with an original, a vigorous, and expanded mind. I have known you, Mr. Rochester, and it strikes me with terror and anguish to feel I absolutely must be torn from you forever. I see the necessity of departure, and it is like looking on the necessity of death. Where do you see the necessity? He asked suddenly. Where? You, sir, have placed it before me. In what shape? In the shape of Miss Ingram, a noble and beautiful woman, your bride. My bride? What bride? I have no bride. But you will. Yes, he says, I will. I will. Then I must go. You have said it yourself. No, you must stay. I swear it, and the oath shall be kept. And here she is. I tell you I must go, I retorted, roused to something like passion. Do you think I can stay to become nothing to you? Do you think I am an automaton, a machine without feelings, and can bear to have my morsel of bread snatched from my lips and my drop of living water dashed from my cup? Do you think, because I am poor, obscure, plain, and little, that I am soulless and heartless? You think wrong. I have as much soul as you, and full as much heart. And if God had gifted me with some beauty and much wealth, I should have made it as hard for you to leave me as it is now for me to leave you. I am not talking to you through the medium of custom, conventionalities, or even of mortal flesh. It is my spirit that addresses your spirit, and it is both. It is as if both had passed through the grave and we stood at God's feet, equal as we are. And he stands up and says, as we are. And then he informs her that she's the one he wants to marry. There's something about those lines. If God had gifted me with some beauty and much wealth, I should have made it as hard for you to leave me as it is now for me to leave you, that I never get through without crying. Here I go again. And it is those lines and that entire scene that made me want to one day write a character as complex and deep and compelling and admirable and lovable and strong as Jane Eyre is. Anyway, I had a feeling that was going to happen today. Anyway, thank you so much for listening. These are the works that made me want to write. I'd love to hear some of you comment, maybe for next time, on the works that made you want to write, paint, dance, sing. Please leave comments on the posts. You can send me your thoughts. I'm on Twitter at Poet Rose. I'm on Facebook, and the Alan Squire Publishing website is alansquirepublishing.com. There are many ways to reach me. My partner in publishing and life, James J. Patterson, is here every Monday at 4 p.m. on this Facebook page, 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time in the United States. It's 9 o'clock in the UK, I think 1 o'clock on the West Coast. He's here every Monday. I'm here every Wednesday. The wonderful poet Reuben Jackson, whose collection Scattered Clouds we published last year, often uploads Friday audio to the site as well. He reads poems by himself and others. I think there's some music coming our way this week from him too. So please stay in touch. Please keep buying books from the site. And by the way, any booksellers who are having trouble getting stock in these challenging virus times, you can get books direct from us. We're happy to consign them. And you can reach us about that through the site as well. Thank you all for listening to these little tidbits of my past. I promise next week will be less autobiographical, but it just felt like the right thing to do today. Love you all. Stay safe. Wear the mask. We're going to get through this, but we got to do it together. Love you. Thanks for listening. Bye.